Well, hello again. Steve Ellis here with I'm Glad You Asked, our online course trying to deal with some of the difficult questions about God and life. Those questions are being raised by our friends, our neighbors, our relatives, even ourselves. Questions about God and life, questions about the Bible, questions about, is there something out there beyond what we see? Are miracles even possible? And that really is the question we're trying to tackle today. Is there an agency out there beyond time, space, history that's ever intervened? And really, what's so important about that anyway? It's very important to people of faith, people like Christians, who find even in their own scriptures statements like these. Peter on the day of Pentecost said, "Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested or validated or proven to you by God with what? Miracles," there it is, wonders and signs, which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. Also, we find the gospel writer John recording the words of Jesus when he said, "Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father in me, otherwise believe on account of the works," the miracles themselves. And then the Apostle Paul, writing to the Corinthians, would state it very emphatically when he said, "If there's no resurrection of the dead, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is vain, empty, worthless, and your faith is also vain." Miracles are pretty important to those of faith. So let's define what a miracle truly is. I think this is a pretty good working definition. It's a phenomenon that occurs in time-space history that is so radically different from the ordinary operations of nature that its observers are justified in attributing it to the direct intervention of a supernatural agent. And we need to deal with the concept of a miracle. What exactly is it? Is it really the violation of natural law? Well, not really. It's basically this, that there's a lower principle, a natural principle, that's superseded by a higher principle or supernatural principle, something that momentarily takes over, doesn't destroy it. It's kind of like the law of gravity, that it's a constant. But if you apply something called the laws of aerodynamics, it will momentarily supersede the law of gravity, enabling a jet plane to fly. If you don't believe that gravity is still in existence, just turn off the engine. Also, within the concept of a miracle, we need to state that that concept is relative, not absolute. For example, for God, there's no miracles. Everything is within his purview. He doesn't see miracles, but we do because we live in a natural world. So when the question comes up, have miracles truly occurred? There are basically three ways you can go with that. Many people will state emphatically, no, there can never be anything that occurs outside of the natural. But I would question, is that not a revealing of an anti-supernatural assumption or bias? How can one say and prove that there is no such thing as the supernatural? Often the response is it's what science shows every day. But shouldn't we admit the limitation of science? Science is best in its descriptive parts than its prescriptive parts. It can describe and test and show what is normal within its own ability to test, but it's not real good at prescribing something outside the realm of science. And the truth is, if there is a God, then miracles are quite possible. So let's examine that from the standpoint of maybe there are some miracles. And since it's something that happens in time-space history, then one should realize that this is a historical issue at its core. And if we want to prove or disprove them, we should look at some instances. So why don't we choose to look at the recorded miracles of Jesus? And while we're at it, why don't we go for the top one? Let's look at the crucial one, the resurrection. When you do, and you try to make a case for the resurrection, it's good to start where there's not much dispute. For example, there are 8 key historical facts that are no longer really disputed much among scholars, historians, both sympathetic and non-sympathetic with the reality of Christianity. There's 3 pre-resurrection facts that aren't really debated anymore, like there was a man, Jesus, who died from Roman crucifixion in the 1st century, and there was a Jesus placed in a secured tomb after his death, and the disciples, those who had followed this Jesus, were quite visibly discouraged. And then there are 5 post-resurrection facts that are not in dispute. For example, that there was a tomb that was found empty, and that tomb had a seal that was broken, and there was a stone moved from the entrance of that tomb. There was a guard that existed, and they would eventually get to some chief priests in Jerusalem to report the empty tomb. There were grave clothes that were found vacated and empty inside that tomb. And note, followers reported soon after that there was a resurrection. I say reported. That doesn't prove that it occurred, but they were going around saying it had happened. Well, you might say, well, that's a sympathetic audience and a sympathetic report. Are there any other non-sympathetic reports of these same facts about Jesus? And we're fortunate that, in fact, there are. For example, there's the Roman historian Tacitus, who was writing about 109 A.D., soon after all these facts. And he started reporting all of Roman history, including the burning of Rome in 64 A.D. You may recall Nero supposedly started that fire, but he didn't want to be accused of it. And so he looked for a scapegoat, and he found Christians throughout Rome. And this is what happened in the report of Tacitus. Tacitus records that Nero fastened the guilt for the fire on the class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered, notice, the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of Pontius Pilate. That's code for crucifixion. And notice the names mentioned that corroborate the Bible story, Pontius Pilate. This is also a mischievous superstition, Tacitus reported, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Well, what is Tacitus recording here? The most mischievous superstition, again, is code for the report of the resurrection. It started in Judea, but it ended up all the way in Rome. We also have a non-sympathetic source in Josephus, the Jewish historian, who wrote, "At about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed, notice, surprising deeds, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, namely the Sadducees, the Pharisees, Pilate, notice there's the name again, had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared." So the facts are reported not only by those who would end up believing in the resurrection, but even those who did not. So if we begin this look at the possibility of miracles, well, again, we're down to the issue of proof. What kind of proof will make our case? Let's look at legal historical proof, because this is a historical issue. And of course, legal historical proof is the rendering of a decision or a verdict based upon the preponderance of credible evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. What's the most reasonable conclusion given the evidence? Well, throughout the ages, there are those who have been trying to offer some conclusion without a resurrection. So let's, through a process of elimination, look at each of these. For example, there are some explanations that don't require resurrection regarding the tomb. There are those that have to do with the tomb still being occupied by the body of Jesus. And one of those ideas is that the tomb was unknown. When the people went to look for the tomb, they didn't know where to go. And so they found an open one and made the false conclusion that Jesus was now resurrected. Well, the problem with that is this was a borrowed tomb from one Joseph of Arimathea. And he, along with Nicodemus and some other women, would go there after the cross and hastily prepare a body and hastily shove it in there. And so they knew exactly where the tomb was. A similar idea populated by some is that even though the tomb was known, on that particular morning of resurrection, they went to the wrong tomb. And the idea here is it was early, it was dark, and the ladies had tears in their eyes, weeping, and so they didn't see clearly. They went to the wrong tomb, and they found an open one, and they concluded falsely Jesus is alive. Well, the same problem exists with this one as did the first one. Joseph of Arimathea could confirm this report. He could go back later in the day, some other time in the week, and determine whether there was a body there or not. Another idea that was popularized was the idea that there was a spiritual resurrection. In other words, not a bodily one. The body's still in the tomb, but some kind of a ghost or spirit came forth and appeared, and people thought it was a bodily resurrection. Well, there's a lot of problems with this one, in that this resurrected body ate fish and showed physical wounds and walked and did a lot of other physical things. It was not just a spirit. And finally, one last idea that somehow people have put out there to keep the tomb occupied was Jesus must have had a twin. He had a big family, so maybe he had a look-alike. And so after his death and burial in the tomb, this twin appeared and went about doing all the things that Jesus reportedly did. A lot, again, the problems of not having crucifixion wounds, the sheer fact that this physical body would ascend in a few days was problematic to this idea. Well, then what about the idea that the tomb was empty, but there was still no resurrection? Some people have speculated, well, the friends came and stole the body and then reported he was resurrected. Lots of problems here. Obviously, the friends were not motivated to do that. They thought the mission was over. The problem of getting past a Roman guard, the problem of even if they got past the Roman guard, they would create such a loud noise physically removing the stone that they would wake up the guard, and on we could go. This one doesn't hold water. What about the idea that enemies came and stole the body? The ones not sympathetic with Jesus came because they feared the friends would come and steal the body. Well, the biggest problem with this is later when the movement began and they were reporting the resurrection, wouldn't the enemies of the movement come along and say, hey, wait a minute, let me produce a dead body, and that whole movement would be over if in fact they had the body. A third idea that became very popular is called the swoon theory. Here, Jesus never really died. He just swooned on the cross. He faked out the Roman executioners, and he was buried inside the tomb. And then because of the coolness and the dampness and the aromatic spices that were put upon his body for the wrapping of the cloths, he resuscitated. And he somehow got out of the grave clothes, and he somehow got to the door, and he moved the stone, and he walked about the whole area showing off a resuscitated body, not a resurrected body. Well, as you can guess, there's a lot of problems here. How would that person get out of the grave clothes? How would he walk about the area on crushed feet from the crucifixion? And on we could go. We had to get past the professional Roman executioners as well, who were by trade able to determine whether or not a body was dead on the cross. And the final idea that's been popularized, very similar to number 3, was the Passover plot. Here, Jesus conspired with Joseph of Arimathea before his death that he would receive a narcotic somehow on the sponge lifted to him on the cross, and that would be sufficient to fake out the Roman executioners. And then the body's buried in Joseph's tomb. Joseph perhaps had a back entrance to this tomb, and he would come in, he would unwrap Jesus, and he would get him out the back way and go about reporting that it was a resurrection, when once again it was just a resuscitation. The same problems for number 3 apply to number 4. This was a body that was broken and beaten and could not have performed to the level of a resuscitated body. Number 4 doesn't hold as well. Well, then skeptics come along and look at the reports of the resurrections. When people began to go around and claim that he was alive and well, they come along and say, well, we can explain those away as well without a resurrection. For example, we would say that those who believed and saw these kind of things simply made up a lie. They fabricated a lie of the resurrection. Well, my response to that would be, is it true that one will die for a known lie? Don't we know how these witnesses ended their life? They left that scene and they went out throughout all of Palestine and all out the known world, all the way to Rome, reporting that there was one Jesus who came back from the dead. And they were met with opposition. people who didn't like the story, didn't like the competition. It challenged their politics. It challenged their religion. And so often they were told, if you don't recant this lie, if you don't tell us you've made this up, we will kill you with horrific deaths, crucifixions, hangings, being flayed to death with a whip, and all kind of things that you and I can't even imagine. If they would simply say it was a lie, they could be spared from those horrific deaths. And yet we know from history, we know from all their stories, they did not. They died those deaths. And the truth here is someone will never die from something they know is a lie. They will always squeal at the last minute. So this accusation doesn't seem to hold forth. Well, maybe they believed they saw Jesus resurrected, but they were hallucinations. But this doesn't fit the characteristic of hallucinations. Hallucinations psychologically are usually private and by one, at most two people. The reports of the resurrection of Jesus were public and by many, sometimes as many as 500 people at one time. So it doesn't fit the characteristic of hallucinations. Well, maybe it's just simply a bunch of guys in a smoke-filled room getting together later and making up a legend. But again, the problem here is the issue of time. They begin reporting this immediately. There was not enough time to pass for this legend to take hold. It takes 40, 50, 60 years for a legend to be made because there's the problem of eyewitnesses. If they make up the story right after the occurrence of Jesus' death and burial, there would be people there that say, no, we were there. You're making it all up. It could not have been a legend. Lastly, I would ask you to consider some circumstantial evidence surrounding the resurrection. For example, Jesus himself foretold the resurrection. And many people say he was a true prophet. He was a man of virtue and spoke truth. If he foretold his resurrection and he's truthful, that must make some sense. I find it compelling that there's a deafening silence of the Jews. Of all the people that ever lived, those Jews who lived in the first century had the highest motivation and the highest opportunity to disprove the resurrection, and yet they did not. We've already mentioned the changed life of the disciples who were cowards before the resurrection, but champions afterwards. You cannot explain the rapid growth and expansion of the early church without those people believing and trusting in the resurrection. We notice that the worship shifts from Saturday to Sunday, from the Sabbath of Jewish worship to the day of resurrection, which was Sunday. We see the resurrection emphasized in baptism and communion. In baptism, we identify with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And in communion, Jesus instituted that by saying, one day I will eat and drink of this with you in the resurrection. I find it interesting, too, that there's a total disregard for the site of Jesus' burial. You may go there and you may find several places they think Jesus was buried, but no one knows for sure. And why? Because he only borrowed that tomb for a couple days and was back to life. And finally, consider the conversions of the half-brother James and Saul. James was a part of the family that came to Jesus at one point thinking he was out of his mind. He wasn't the Messiah. And yet after the resurrection, James becomes one of the leaders of the church of the resurrection. And of course, Saul, the doubting persecutor of the church, became Paul, the great apostle, after he met the resurrected Jesus Christ. So when you combine all this evidence and you reason your way through all that has been talked about historically, what's the most reasonable conclusion investigating such evidence? Simply this, that the reasonable conclusion is Jesus Christ rose from the dead exactly as he predicted. All the other possibilities don't seem to hold any merit. When one says, maybe the resurrection occurred, the answer is yes, the miracles have occurred. The resurrection has occurred. And when yes is the only option left, one would have to realize the purpose of the miracles is to be catalytic to faith, to move us to believe in that which God has said, and to realize that Christ's resurrection validates his entire ministry. One would need to consider the claims of a resurrected Christ. When you look at all the options and ask the question, have miracles occurred? It is a resounding yes. Thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity to talk about the possibility of miracles, and I hope you'll join us again on future episodes here at I'm Glad You Asked. For now, this is Steve Ellis saying goodbye.